Hello and welcome. I'm Nancy Adamick from Lena Patchwork, and welcome to the second part of our curves tutorial. Now, if you haven't watched part 1, I recommend that you go back and watch it first, because we're going to continue on from that. Okay, so here we go. We start with the Applecore shape. Now, the Applecore shape has two types of curves. It has an outward curve, which we have covered in tutorial 1. And it has an inward curve, which we're going to tackle in this tutorial here. So there are a few tricks that you use when we're working with Applecores, is that it's one of the shapes where the run of the grain of the fabric is very important. And we want the grain of the fabric to run diagonally across the shape. So I've marked one of my Applecore pieces up here to illustrate that to you. So when you're placing it onto your fabric, you want to make sure that the grain of the fabric runs like this. So the Applecore sort of stands on tip, if you want. We have to trim the fabric to size. And the best thing to do for that is to just pin the Applecore in place with a couple of small pins. And you take your sharp fabric scissors and you just cut parallel to the paper shape, just eyeballing a generous seam allowance of, I would say, at least 3/8 of an inch. All the way around on all sides, just sort of following the curves. Like this. So the next thing is we want to thread our needle, and we have to have some small sharp scissors at hand which will cut fabric, and we start covering our paper shape on the outward curved bit. We sort of start in the top, in the middle. We fold the fabric over and make a little basting stitch. And then we smooth the fabric over the edge and make small tacking stitches until we are about 1/4 inch away from the edge of the paper shape, like here. Now I need to snip this fabric seam allowance on the Applecore inward curve. Please don't start on the very corner, but start at least 1 centimeter in, or not, yeah, 1/2 inch maybe. So that's my first snip. And I cut quite deep, but I do not cut all the way to the paper shape. Always leave some space here. Can you see? I didn't cut quite that deep. And my next cut is about 1/4 inch away from that. So I cut every 1/4 inch, snip the fabric seam allowance along the side, but I stop short about 1/2 inch from the corner. And I only do one side at a time. So now I make sure that my curve is still, my fabric is still folded over this curve here, and then I fold the corner. Fold the fabric around that corner bit there. And then I'm going to secure it with some stitches so it doesn't shift. So that's nice and snug around the corner, but make sure that you don't accidentally fold the corner of the paper shape. It happens a lot to beginners. And now you can see, now suddenly I can nicely smooth my fabric around this inward curve. And this is possible because we have the fabric on the bias in this case, so it doesn't pucker. So that's that bit. Now I fold the corner over and secure that. and do this second outward curve of my Applecore. There we go. I'm just going to tuck the thread out of the way for a moment here while I snip this edge now. Again, I don't really start at the very edge, but sort of half an inch in, and snip every 1/4 inch till I'm about ½ inch away from that corner. I found this to be really the best way to do it, to snip the fabric only as you come to that edge. Otherwise, if your paper shape slips around while you're tacking and you have already snipped the seam allowance, you may actually not have enough seam allowance, and you may have a frayed edge on your inward curve, which would be a shame. So there's that bit. A couple more stitches, and our first Applecore is done. Snip the thread with a bit of spare, take the pins out, and there's your beautifully covered Applecore shape. No puckers on the front. Even if there are slight distortions of the fabric, once they're sewn together, the fabric usually relaxes, so don't worry too much about those things. Just give it a go, see how it goes, and get some practice in. So if we now want to put these together in a pattern, the only way the Applecores really fit together is one is upright, one lies down, one is upright, one lies down, yeah, like that. That's the way they are sewn together or fit together. So what you can do is you can make them into little units like these, and then join those together in a scrap block. And if you always have a light color and a dark color, it gives some nice pattern variations there. So let's sew two together. I get often asked, what thread color shall I use? Shall I go, if I have two different colors, do I go with the darker one or the lighter one? And I would advise you to try them both. I often find that the darker color actually works better than the lighter color. Anyway, back to the Applecores. So if you're used to normal paper piecing with straight edged pieces, and you'll know that these are curves, and we always lay them right sides on top of each other, don't we? And line up the seams. Well, that's not really possible on a curve, is it? Especially when one goes one way and one goes the other. So here's what we do. We start like that. We line up the corner, and we do our first couple of stitches, maybe even a 1/4 inch length of a seam, ½ centimeter or so, 3-4 stitches, just to have a start. But we can't continue like that, not without really disturbing the whole paper shape. So what you do then is you fold it out, so you unfurl it, so to speak. And now we're going to slip stitch it from behind. I find it's easier if I hold it with my left hand, hold the seam together, and then pick up my stitches going from the right piece across to the left piece. So you're only picking up the fabric which is on the paper side of the shape with this slip stitching. The slip stitching never looks as neat on the back, I find, well, at least not when I do it, but then nobody's perfect. And you just work your way along. And can you see why we were not supposed to cut so deep? Because if you had cut deeper on these inward curves, you would now work with a frayed fabric edge, and that would not be good in a seam. you would very soon have a hole develop there. So we keep slip stitching. The distance of the stitches, just the same as you would on the other paper pieces. I always say a couple of millimeters or so between each stitch is plenty, or 3 stitches to 1/8, something like that. And when you're sort of halfway around your shape, you can always check, do my ends actually line up? And with a little gentle push and pull, you can make them line up. So you have to keep a little bit of an eye on that. Almost there. So this slip stitching on the back, you need a bit of time to get used to that, a little bit of practice. But it has one really nice side effect in that these stitches are virtually invisible on the front of the piece. So I know a lot of ladies who started to sew all their English paper piecing with this stitch. But I find it a bit cumbersome to do, so I would never use it myself on a straight seam. I just find it easier to whip stitch, and I don't mind if my stitches show, really. Okay, I'm at the end of the seam. I've stitched backwards 3 or 4 stitches, and now I'm casting off by weaving the needle through the seam allowance a few tiny stitches, so that we have a neat finish and I can cut my thread short. And look, can't see the stitches on the front, except for the first few where we've done the whip stitch. But that doesn't bother me. So I'm going to do the other one as well. So now I have 2 identical pieces, and if I turn one of them around, I can then sew them together into this 4-patch unit. And when you have several of these 4-patch units, like here, you can then sew them together into a quilt. So that's the Applecore. The other shape I want to show you in this second part of our tutorial is the clamshell. And a lot of people break into a cold sweat when they hear the clamshell, because it's quite a difficult shape to work with. Certainly not for beginners, not without doing the first parts of the tutorial first. So this is a clamshell. It's derived from a circle by overlapping another circle and cutting a piece off it. So the fabric preparation is the same as for all of other shapes. So here's my fabric. Now for this one, it doesn't matter whether it's on slight point or not, or the grain of the fabric isn't so important here. The important thing is that you have enough fabric all the way around, including the tip at the bottom here, so don't stinge on the fabric here. Pin it in place. I like to use 1 pin in the top, and then 1 to secure this very fine tip. It sort of really runs into nothing. So of course we also have to trim the fabric. Again, I just use my good scissors and cut around all the sides, including this very fine tip of the Applecore, the clamshell, pardon me. Like that. Now ready to tack. And we tack again, starting at the top. We could start here, but let's start at the top here. Fold it over, and do a little tacking stitch. And we keep smoothing the fabric over the edge here. working our way towards the corner. Okay, so now I have to snip this side here of my fabric edge, the seam allowance. So I get my little snips out, and again, starting about 1/2 inch from the edge, I snip every 1/4 inch, but leave a healthy bit of seam before the paper. Also, don't cut too far down, maybe one more snip here. Again, stop about 1/2 inch from the tip. So now I can easily fold the fabric around my corner here of the clamshell. And start working my way down towards this tip. This is a bit more tricky. That's why we're doing it on a big shape, to show it's a bit easier on the bigger shapes. But I have also taught beginners to use the smaller clamshell, so it is possible. What you will not be able to do is you will not be able to accurately fold the fabric around this very fine point. Forget it, it won't happen. What you instead do is you make a little tail, like we do on diamonds. So you fold the fabric one way, you turn the piece over, you snip your other seam allowance here, again staying well away from the tip, at least 1/2 inch, and then cut every 1/4 inch till you're 1/2 inch from this side. So now we just fold it over the other way, and we make quite a hefty little tail here on the tip of our clamshell. And that's fine. And I'll explain in a minute why that is okay. Somehow try to secure this with a few stitches. And now we're on the home straight. Oops. There we go. Take the pin out. And there is your covered clamshell. Here are a few more that I prepared earlier. And you can see they all have a little tail at these very fine point, and all the tails point, they actually point to the right, because if I turn it over it has to point to the right. I'm right-handed. All the tails, when I look at the paper side of the shape, they all must first of all point in the same direction, and they should all point to the right, and they do. I'm not going to trim anything of these for now. For sewing these together, it's not actually as difficult as it looks. What we do is we'll make a decision about our layout. So if we say I want to have a row of blue ones and then a row of yellow ones, that means I can sew these two onto my yellow top. The easiest way to do that is to take your paper shape, and you fold the clamshell in half and give it a really good crease here at the top. That's there. If you want to, you can mark it with a pin, because sometimes in the artificial light it's not easy to see where the fold is, but it's quite important to get this accurate. There we go, that's my middle. And now, rather than starting at this side of the clamshell and working towards the top, we're going to start at the top and work our way down, because that's much easier and more accurate. So I align the first bit of this clamshell with my pinpoint there. Just secure it with a stitch or two. Then I can take the pin out. And slip stitch along. Until we're at the other end. Okay, so we're sort of nearly 2/3 done. Just want to turn it over and show you something. So I'm just going to do an anchoring stitch there, just a stitch on the spot to stop it unraveling. Now when I turn this over now, can you see how the point of my clamshell actually disappears here? So here you can see this very fine point of the clamshell, and it sort of disappears into nothing, and it actually finishes before we get to the edge of this clamshell point here. It disappears. And if we have a second clamshell here, and we sew the other inward curve, we actually sew the last 2 stitches, we will sew these clamshells together, and the tip disappears into nothing. I hope that sort of makes sense. However, anyway, that is the reason why it is not so crucially important that we fold this very accurately around the tip, which is impossible anyway. I look at it as like a built-in fudge factor to get it done. Right, so let's continue sewing till the tip. So you essentially keep sewing until about 1/4 inch from the end of the other clamshell. Sew as far as you can. So you can see the tail here is in the way, so what I do is when I work on the tip, I just fold the tail out of the way. There's one more stitch. Maybe we can just ease out one more. And an extra stitch on the spot to secure that. You can see there's about 1/4 inch left here. So I'm going to finish off my seam by stitching in the reverse direction so I can cast off. And now I could use this yellow one here and sew from this direction. Maybe I should do that. Can you see how my pieces align here nicely? That's what we want. If they don't align, we can push and pull a bit until they do. But that looks good, so we just keep going. So I'm now coming to the tip here. I think I can make a couple more stitches. This one's probably my last one. I'd put an anchoring stitch on top of that. Just checking on the other side. Fold that up. It's not so easy to hold, especially for the camera to see. And now I'm slit stitching the 2 yellow pieces together. anchoring stitch, and then stitch backwards to be able to cast off. Just want to cast off on this side here, makes it easier. Then I turn it over, and here is our tip sewn in. Looks great. That wasn't so difficult, was it? So what I can do now is I can actually trim this excess fabric on my clamshell tip here. So again, don't ever go with your scissors near the seam itself. Always stay at least a 1/4 inch or so away. Just want to trim a bit of that off, that bulk. We don't need that. That's much better, isn't it? So now you can add all your other clamshells in the same manner, and it's really quite a difficult way of sewing them, but once you learn how to do the inward curves and how to do the slip stitching, it's not that difficult anymore. Traditionally, the clamshells are done in a slightly different way, and I have prepared some samples for that too. And that's done here. So traditionally what we did is we only covered the round bits, the outward curves of our clamshells papers, but not the fine points, because a lot of people find it too challenging, and if they don't know the right methods, you can't do it. So they would only cover the top bits. Then they would stitch these together just where the corners of the clamshells are, just a couple of little stitches to hold them together so that you can put them on like a bit of a string, like a bunting, clamshell bunting. And then you would take these clamshell bunting and you would put it onto a background fabric, pin it in place, and then applique along the top round bits. So that would be the first row, and then you would put the second row on top of that, lining up the tops of your clamshells by folding them in half, marking the top with a crease. You can then line that up with those folds. Pin it in place and tack it, and then applique over these bits. You would then remove the papers afterwards once you have cut the background fabric behind it away. And that's the classic layout of clamshells as well. But if you want to, you can actually play with the clamshells and other round shapes, like a circle here, and sew them together in other patterns. And how about this little flower? You can fit them together with shapes that come from the same parent circle, if you like. So that's your clamshells done. Not that difficult after all. And when you can do these kind of shapes, then you can also do a wedding ring by hand. So maybe we'll do a tutorial about that sometime in the future. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.